Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am deeply concerned about the crisis of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve, and this is true in my home city of Memphis, unfortunately, because we are not a stranger to the issue. From my perspective, there are several things we can do here in Congress to help. I've introduced bills to address many of these issues. One would be a way we can use technology and data to improve police-civilian interactions. The Police Camera Act, H.R. 120, would provide grants for state and local jurisdictions to purchase cameras for their officers. And we also need to collect data and technology to be useful about policing practice, to make law enforcement more responsive and responsible, and that's why I introduced the National Statistics on Deadly Force Transparency Act of 2019, which is H.R. 119. And communities need to feel safe that law enforcement agencies are accountable for their actions, that nobody is above the law. It's a shame the Department of Justice, which has been effective in the past, has stepped back from providing independent review and accountability for police practices. Along with Congressman Lacey Clay, we have introduced the Police Training and Independent Review Act, H.R. 125. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce a letter of support for that act from the NAACP in June of 2019.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to ask Chief Hawkins what our bill would do, besides have sensitivity training for policemen about minorities and different areas that might not be of their history. It would say that the law enforcement agency that would determine if there should be a grand jury and determine whether or not there should be a prosecution and also prosecute the case should come from a jurisdiction other than that from which the law enforcement came. In my experience, I started my professional life after law school as the attorney for the police in Memphis. There's no question there's home cooking. Many people from law enforcement go and work as investigators for the DA, and it's almost like a farm team. And so from my perspective, you can't have absolute independence if the DA has to go to the grand jury, and if the DA indicts a policeman, gets a policeman indicted, then the police, as we saw in New York, and I think it might have been in the I don't know if it was the Garner case or another one, but the police all went out against the DA. They protested.
Are you saying change jurisdiction, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
You think that's a good idea?
I think so, sir. That gives an unbiased ability to gauge the facts of the situation and facts of the case and a good review of it.
And Mr. Davis, do you have any thought about that type of concept?
Yes, sir, I do. It was actually two recommendations in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The first would start with the investigation, that it should be an investigation by the department, not overseeing the officer who's involved in the shooting.
It would be a separate total law enforcement agency.
Yes, so that I, as a detective, don't have to interview or investigate somebody I worked with for 20 years. The second part would be that as prosecutors and police work together on a daily basis and just the things necessary to make communities safe, that you then go outside that jurisdiction as well so that you can have a separate jurisdiction, look at the prosecution, convene a grand jury. So I would agree with you. This level of independence is important to build trust in a process that people think is so insular and so designed to benefit the officer that we need that. And I said those were two recommendations from the President's Task Force.
And now I'm going to take a long shot when you're not supposed to ask a question where you don't have some kind of an idea of what the answer is going to be. The gentleman from the Fraternal Order of Police, and I appreciate your position, and I'm a former ICP person, but do you not see the benefit that might give to law enforcement and everybody else seen as a fair shake?
Sir, I can tell you that I think that a collaborative effort on a local level, of which law agencies are based on local jurisdictions, that should be the very first part of reviewing any systemic problems there are within agencies. There are processes within each state of how they handle them, and we support those positions that are taken within those states to investigate crimes or incidents.
Thank you, sir. Later this week, I'm going to introduce the Deadly Force Independent Review Act, which will provide independent review of instances when a federal law enforcement officer has used deadly force. I think that'll help too. Reverend Sharpton, what do you think? You've been active for many years on all these issues. What do you think are the most important reforms that we can take up to try to cure these problems? What works best?
I think that what we need is clear legislation on where the police are to be dealing with federal charges in excessive force. What raises to the bar of a federal crime? It is too nebulous now. That Secondly, that we would have some preventative measures in, like cameras on police that cannot be turned off, and that when consent decrees are audited by the Justice Department, they remain, even if administrations change, that they remain. And that we have constant reviews by the Justice Department with the department there on policing around the country, particularly looking for pattern and practices. I think if we start with legislation, not just with feel-good programs, but legislation, so police know they're accountable legislatively, not just on a local and state level, which is what had to happen with voting and other things in the civil rights era.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back the balance of my time.